I've been dying to get this story off my chest for years to people who don't think I'm crazy, as it's rather maddening. Before I begin, I don't believe in things like Bigfoot, werewolves, ghosts, supernatural or paranormal stuff in general, but that doesn't mean that I'm able to explain what happened this night. This was a long time ago. I was a teenager. My parents were not very strict, so I had a lot of freedom. I had 2 friends, and they had their own friends as well. And one of my friends' parents owned this huge part of a forest. My friends, their friends, and I went deep into the woods with a bunch of supplies, and we started making our own treehouse and forts. It was a big part of my childhood, building stuff with my friends, and this place became our sanctuary for a long time, where we'd spend a lot of our time away from the adults. This event happened years after we built the place initially, and also after we rebuilt it because one time it got destroyed. But that's another interesting story for a different time. This is the backstory for all of the events that I'm about to recall. One friend and I spent the night at our sanctuary that we had built, which none of us have ever done before. We only hung out there and then went home. We all planned to spend the night together because it would be fun. Most of our friends weren't allowed to spend the night there, though, because of parents and other things, and one chickened out because he was afraid. So it ended up just being me and one other person, my close friend's cousin. We weren't really close at the time, and we fought a lot, but surprisingly we got along well that night. We spent most of the day swinging from trees, climbing them and hanging out on this tire rope swing while talking. It was a normal day. And then we laid down for rest at about 9 p.m. About 10 minutes after laying down in bed in our sleeping bags, talking to each other under our makeshift tents, we heard rustling. I sat up and saw a very tall silhouette of something that looked to be like a human but was transparent. I could see right through it. I squinted and froze, and it very quickly climbed this tall tree. And as I was looking at it, it disappeared. I was in complete disbelief and shock. I had no idea what I had just seen, if I had seen it at all, or if I had hallucinated. I wasn't scared in the moment, just perplexed. Being young and worried, though, I said to my friend that we should leave, and not wanting it to hear me, I got close to his ear and just said, "There's something in the woods looking at us." After I said that, I saw his facial expression turn to fear, so we got up and started walking down the path out of the woods, calmly. I didn't want to sprint because it might chase, and I also wasn't even sure I'd seen anything. I just didn't want to take any chances. Very shortly after we left, we both got this weird feeling of déjà vu and confusion, like we'd been hit with hard drugs or something, except we don't do drugs, and we had only eaten food that we brought from our house. There are also no hallucinogenic plants in our part of the country. Nothing like that. Everything was so slow, and I felt disoriented. But we continued to walk in this direction for quite a while, stumbling in the darkness because of our mental state. I realized that we should have been out of the forest by now. I knew that this was the way out, 110%, because I'd been going in and out of this place for years, even in the dark. Yet I didn't recognize all the trees around us, just the path. It was like our surroundings were changing. My friend randomly yells, "Yeah, I'm coming," as I'm looking in the opposite direction from him. I turned around, very confused, and asked him why he said that. He said that his mom was calling his name to help lead him out of the forest. I heard nothing. I told him that I didn't hear anything, and he looked at me like I was insane and walked off the path and into the forest. I grabbed his arm and pulled him back because I didn't want him to get lost. That's when my friend sees the transparent thing that I saw earlier, sitting perched on a tree branch in the direction that his mom was calling him from. He points it out to me. Its transparency is almost like a heat wave effect. We stared at it for 10 seconds in total disbelief. It looked like a transparent being, but we were trying to discern if it was something else, and we were just imagining it being alive. because there was no movement. But then, it hunched down like it was trying to stalk or be stealthy, and very quickly, it climbed up a tree a little more, and then went to the next one, and then the next one, getting closer to us. We can't hear it at all. It's completely silent, and its silence was exacerbated by the fact that all the other creatures had also gone completely silent, and it was only in that moment that I had really started to realize that. Not a single bug or animal had made a sound since we started leaving camp. This is when our curiosity turned into fear, and once again, we began to see it move. Once it got above us, though, the only thing we could hear was the crunching of the branch as its weight was put down on it. Every little sound that was made was so distinct because it was so quiet and remote. We couldn't see anything because the tops of the trees are so dark. We actually started running, terrified, not worrying about being calm anymore. We heard noises in the trees above us, and finally it faded away ahead of us, as if it had gone ahead, but the sound was a lot quieter than if a normal animal had been running through the treetops. It sounded as if this thing was very light, but it wasn't very small, so that made no sense. We still kept running forward, despite it sounding like it had gone ahead, and we ended up back at the place that we started. Many, many minutes of walking, and we were back at this place after running for like 20 seconds. It was impossible. But instead of staying on the ground, we climbed to the top of the treehouse with our items as quickly as possible and closed the door, wedging a small piece of plywood on it to keep it shut. We heard something climbing up, and extremely odd noises as well, almost like the mimicking noises of rain and wind, but there was no water seeping into our treehouse, and there would have been had it been raining, and it wasn't wet. This persisted for about a minute, and then we didn't hear from it again. I'm pretty sure at that point it had left, but we spent the rest of the night there until the sun came up anyway, just in case. When he checked his iPod Touch for the first time, right after we closed the door, it was 5 a.m. We started laying on the ground at 9 p.m. 8 hours had passed in what felt to us like no more than 40 minutes of time. Hours after we could start to see the sun through the treehouse slats, we went home. I no longer talked to this friend, but after this incident we discussed it, and we told everything from both of our points of view, and it all jived. We randomly brought it up to each other every few months and relived it, making sure that we were still on the same page about what happened and that we both remembered. I never spent the night out there again, and I didn't really even let myself stay out there past 5 p.m. for a very long time. Over the course of 2 years, I've had weird dreams about a very specific creature lurking in the attic. It always felt malevolent. Now, I don't know if it's an actual thing or my subconscious messing with me, but it deeply unsettled me in ways that my dreams almost never do. As somebody who is always aware that they're dreaming, even dreams where I'm being hunted down don't scare me, but this does. There have been so many dreams about it, but a few stick in my head. The least threatening one was a dream where I'm playing video games in my room. I glance out of my bedroom door, and I see an arm dangling from the open attic. The hand moves like it's beckoning me to come closer. I don't, because, obviously, but I watch it. It never leaves the attic, but it keeps trying to get me to go to it. Another dream, I'm in a house I've never been in. My sister and nieces are in this house with me, and I get the impression that this thing is threatening my family. I'm angry, so I get vocally aggressive. I get my family out of there and go back to confront the thing. I see it, for the first time in all the dreams that I've had. It was a woman with light purple skin and dreadlocks. I don't remember how this dream ended, but there were more dreams after, never including my family again, just me. The most intense encounter I had was a dream where the attic was right above the bed I was sleeping in. I was lying there, very aware that it was watching me. I figured if I ignored it, it would go away. Wrong. It slowly pulled the covers off of me. After a few minutes of lying there, cold, trying to decide if it was safe to pull the blanket back up, it grabs me by the throat and lifts me up about a foot off the bed and starts choking me. I felt like my lungs were going to burst when it let go and let me fall back onto the bed, gasping for breath. I don't know how many dreams I've had since this one, but I know it's been at least a year since I dreamt about it. I'm very uneasy around attics now, and I always expect to look up and see it again when I pass underneath one, awake or not. Even right now, I keep throwing glances at the attic door right outside my bedroom. Nothing's there, of course, but it's still on my mind. If this thing is not my subconscious and it's an actual entity, I have no idea what it could be. In my limited experience with the paranormal, I've never encountered anything that felt malevolent before. Just this. My hope is that either my brain just decided it wanted to be terrified of attics, or that this thing got bored with me and left me forever. This happened when I was around 9 or 10. I was staying the night at my friend Catherine's for the first time. We met the summer before, and we'd been inseparable ever since. Kat lived in this old 2-story house, surrounded by woods and dirt road. The house itself gave me an uneasy feeling when I first saw it. The shutters were falling off. The paint on the house seemed to be fading. It was an old piece of crap now that I think about it, but at the time, I was excited. I remember walking in after staring at the house for what seemed like 20 minutes. Surprisingly, the inside was a lot nicer than the outside, so I pushed that uneasy feeling down and just shrugged it off as nerves. I remember the smell of the house. I can't pinpoint it, but it was different, like walking into a musty room. I started to walk around, just to explore my surroundings, but I noticed Kat's mom watching me. I simply smiled and waved, but she just stood there, staring at me, wide-eyed. I had never met her before, but why was she staring at me like that? Suddenly, Kat flew around the corner and tackled me. We both fell and started to giggle. I noticed Kat's mom out of the corner of my eye start to turn around and walk off, and she was gone. Fast forward a couple of hours. Kat and I are laying on a beanbag in her room watching Children of the Corn, which, by the way, was one of my favorite movies at the time. I grew up watching horror movies, mostly Stephen King or any movie that my mom was watching at the time. Not her decision, but mine, because I love the feeling that a good horror movie gives you. She felt the same way, and that's why we clicked so much. Anyway, we were sitting here watching this movie, and suddenly the door opposite us slams closed. We both jumped and giggled and brushed it off because, well, we were kids. Until the second time, when it creaked open and slammed again, not seconds after the first time. Now I'm sitting there staring at this door, trying to figure out how in the world it's opening and closing by itself. In the midst of all that, the only other person in this house is Kat's mom, which I figured out earlier in the day was also just a tad creepy. "Do you think it's just your mom?" I asked, but she just shook her head. "Are you sure?" I asked again, but this time she said something that gave me the chills, and still does. She said, "My mom isn't home. It's just me and you, silly." I just stared at her, trying to wrap my head around what she had just said. Who leaves their 9-year-old home alone with a friend in a 2-story house? "Where's your mom?" I asked her. "She's at work." I giggled, thinking that she was just trying to trick me. No, she's at work. She only works for a couple of hours, so she leaves me here because she trusts me. At this point, I'm just looking at her, and she noticed this look of worry on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked. I said, "If your mom is at work, then who was that lady staring at me earlier?" As I said this, we heard what seemed like footsteps at the time, but thinking about it now, it sounded more like shuffling in one spot, above us. I'm completely scared at this point. Every hair on my neck is standing on end, and I just want to leave. I start to get up when Kat pulled me back down and asked me if I heard that noise. I nodded. It was silent again, until the footsteps were back, but louder and faster. We both stared up at the ceiling, and she grabbed my hand. "This happens every day," she whispered. I looked over at her, and I could see true fear on her face. The footsteps stopped, and she looked at me, her face flushed white. "Is there an attic?" I asked. She pointed up toward the ceiling. "Well, maybe it's just squirrels or birds," I kept thinking, over and over. You ever notice when you're really quiet, that's when you can hear almost everything around you? Imagine if you're sitting in a house with your best friend alone at 10 years old, and you hear the giggle of a 3-year-old child. Mind you, she has no siblings. We were completely alone. Kat was just as scared as I was. I remember thinking that I just wanted to get out of this house. I grabbed her and ran out the door. At least we would feel safer and less scared outside the house than we would in it. "Want to hear a story?" Kat asked, pulling my mind back into reality. I nodded. "Well, this house used to be a daycare. There was this lady that would watch the kids, and one day she just locked them all in the attic, and then she hung herself from a rope in the kitchen. They all died because the kids were hungry and thirsty, and no one found them for months afterwards, in this house." My heart started to pound, my eyes wide with fear, and I just looked at her. "It's true," she said. "I've seen them, the little kids, every day, but I've never seen the lady. But you have, earlier." After she told me this, I don't remember much else except running out the door of her room and making it outside. Kat followed, begging me to stay, but I just had to get out. My stomach felt like knots. I felt as though I had walked into a horror movie, and I just wished the day had never happened. Fast forward years later, that was the last day I had ever seen or heard from Kat. I remember her always coming to play outside at my dad's during the day. I remember what she looked like. I never remembered meeting her parents or seeing them out in public. I'm now 27, and I can't seem to find any proof that she exists. All my friends that I was friends with then, I'm still friends with now, even after all these years. But why not her? I think her scary story might have had some flaws, but I still wonder what happened in that house. I've driven by there maybe 15 times, and I still wonder if maybe she was one of the ones that never made it out. This incident in particular happened late one night in my grandma-in-law's kitchen. Grandma had a sister-in-law who was visiting from the East Coast. She had gotten in late that night, and I went over to visit the two of them with my husband. We were all sitting around the kitchen table, the same one that my grandpa-in-law's mother had owned when she built the house. There were a lot of jokes going around the table, and Grandma started coughing from laughing too hard. Now, she was in poor health as it was, and she was supposed to take breathing treatments. However, with her having so much fun, a rare occasion since Grandpa had passed, she didn't want to leave the table. My husband was concerned and told her that she had to take her breathing treatment. After some convincing, she got up and started heading in that direction. But then she got sucked back into the conversation and distracted from her treatment again. She again started coughing heavily. This was the moment when my husband told her again she needed to take her treatment. He said, "If Grandpa saw you right now, he'd be nagging you to take your treatment." "That's right," my grandma's sister-in-law said. "Don't make me have him call you." Grandma gave a little, "yeah, right," kind of chuckle. Right at that moment, the sister-in-law's track phone that she only uses when traveling started to ring. We all stood there spooked for a moment, and the sister-in-law went to answer it. Immediately, it disconnected as soon as she opened it, after several rings. The weirdest part is that this was at like 11:30 p.m. East Coast time, on a phone that nobody would have the number to outside of my immediate family. Grandma immediately took her breathing treatment after that, not wanting to argue with what could have been a message from beyond the grave. Her husband had always diligently reminded her about her treatments while he was alive, so we didn't think it would be unusual for him to do the same after. I'm not sure what exactly happened there, but I like to think that it was Grandpa. I know my grandma felt that way too, especially after other instances of footsteps in the house and sounds of him getting up in the night for water long after he passed. This happened a couple of weeks after my dad passed. It was the week that I had gotten a new couch. I fell asleep on it while watching TV. I awoke to the telephone ringing in the middle of the night. I got up and walked around my coffee table, picked up the phone and said, "Hello?" It was my father. He sounded as chipper as ever. He said, "Hello, my dear." I told him that he was dead. He said, "Oh, no, dear. I'm just here swimming with the dolphins." After hearing him say that, I vaguely remembered walking on a beach and talking with him, a memory I'd nearly forgotten. The next day, I received a phone call from some friends who were down in Mexico. I had given them some of his ashes and told them to disperse them somewhere they thought he would like. As she was talking, I abruptly interrupted her to tell her my story. We hadn't spoken about the ashes at all in this conversation. She went silent for a full minute and finally said, "You are never going to believe this." She and her husband had chartered a boat the day previous. They had asked the captain to stop so that they could release their friend who had passed. The captain obliged. Not a minute after they released my father, the dolphins showed up and started to play in the water. They stayed and watched them for an hour. So, yeah, my dad literally was swimming with the dolphins. This isn't my story, but it is my parents and two incredibly close family friends who told it. Before I was born, the four of them used to hang out a lot. They would often drive far out into the Mojave Desert, just to party and to drink around a fire and have a good time. For this story, I'm going to call my dad Conrad and my mom Stacy. They're friends. I'll call Brad and Gina. So they drive all the way out into the desert and have a fire. It's summertime, and it's hot. Although it's the middle of the night, it's still warm. My mom, Stacy, and her friend Gina were starting to get scared about tarantulas and decided that they didn't want to camp out there after all. So all four of them started driving back. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and they were on a dirt road that went for miles and miles with nothing on it. Suddenly, up ahead in the headlights, they saw the silhouette of a man in a long black trench coat with a wide-brimmed hat. The collar of his coat was pulled up. He was walking alongside the road, going the same direction that they were driving. My dad grew up hitchhiking a lot, and he used to pick up hitchhikers as well. So my mom knew that my dad would consider stopping and talking to this guy to see if he needed a ride. But they got this terrible feeling about him. My mom always said that just in the way he was walking, the way he looked and how he was dressed, and how he was just out there in the middle of nowhere with nothing, he just emitted this really messed up energy that felt absolutely terrifying and even evil. Gina felt the same way. My dad starts joking, "Hey, let's pick this guy up." And my mom and Gina immediately start screaming and crying and begging him not to. They were in the back seat. My dad was driving and Brad was in the passenger seat. Gina was even kind of punching my dad in the back, screaming, "No, don't stop, don't stop." I guess my dad slowed way down as he passed him though, and they all turned to look at him as they went by. But the moment that they passed him, he was gone. He disappeared into thin air. It's not like there were rocks or trees or anything to hide behind. The weird thing is, I grew up hearing this story from my parents, but living far away from their friends. When I was very young, we moved up north, and they lost touch. Although whenever we would come back to California to visit, we'd always get together with them, and it was like nothing had changed. I moved back to California as an adult, and I work for Gina now. One of our first conversations when I came back was about the Hat Man. She brought it up, not me. And word for word almost, it was the exact same story that my parents had always told me growing up. To be honest, I've always secretly feared, yet been very intrigued by this entity because of their story, and then so many more stories that I have now read online. I couldn't believe it was such a big phenomenon when I first found it on the internet, because I was growing up just hearing my parents' story, long before the internet even existed. To this day, he fascinates and terrifies me. Through my younger years, from about 7 to 12, my mother dated a guy very on and off, which I think mostly had to do with him being in the army and staying with his family in Laredo, Texas whenever he was home. Either way, he invited us to visit his cousin's summer cabin in Monterrey, Mexico for a weekend, so we did. The cabin was very ranch style, longer in one dimension and shorter in the other, so it was built like an architectural rectangle. On one far side of the building, think of this in an aerial view, was the kitchen, and next to it was the living room. Attached to the living room was a long, slender hallway, connected to bedrooms on each side, and a bathroom on one of the sides. The backyard was only accessible through the living room via a sliding door, and what started as a bit of the desert floor met by a forest's tree line, although there weren't a lot of trees. Mostly it was dead and dying Monterey cypress trees. Meeting the so-called tree line was an elevated hunting tower. Its platform met the top of the vertical tree line. On our way to the cabin, my mom's boyfriend was telling us about a cursed legend of the witches of Monterey. Apparently, they had been haunting the mountainous area for generations, and were his childhood version of La Llorona. Clearly, he was trying to scare us from the get-go, and me being so young, I was eating it up like candy. We got to the cabin in the late evening, so we decided to stay in for the night and watch M. Night Shyamalan's The Lady in the Water. After the movie, my mom's boyfriend asked me to go get something from the bedroom for him, and as I was halfway down the hallway, he turned the lights off on me. Let me remind you that this was a very rural part of Mexico, so the dark was dark. So with all the scary stories and the, at the time for me, scary movie, I was spooked and I froze. My mom's boyfriend began to make your stereotypical ghost noises and taunted me to go deeper into the dark hallway. But I was so petrified, I remember just standing there, frozen in fear. Long story short, my mother got onto him and he turned the lights back on. They comforted me, and after a few apologies, we all went to bed. I can't remember how I slept that night, but I honestly wish I did. The next day, we did basic tourist things. Went to a bazaar, embraced the city's beautiful mountain range, which seemed to hug the city, ate authentic Mexican food, and visited the main hub of the city. When the day was all done, we decided to call it and went back to the cabin. What's strange is that I remember the night before so vividly, but I can't remember much about this night other than what I'm about to share with you. I was in the living room of the cabin, and I remember my mom's boyfriend was there with me. He asked if I wanted to go up into the hunting tower out back with him, and I said yes. I remember following him through the back door of the living room, and I remember him walking ahead and turning back to wave me toward him. I thought he was just trying to help me keep up with him, so I followed him. I watched him climb up the ladder of the hunting tower, and then I heard a voice behind me. "Hey, where are you going?" I turned around. It was my mom's boyfriend, behind me, asking where I was going. I didn't know how to say, "I was following you." I turned back around to look at the hunting tower along the tree line, and nobody was there. Nothing was. Not an animal, not my mother, not a ghost, nothing. Fast forward to a few years ago. My now wife and I were still dating at the time, and sharing ghost experiences with one another. I told her about this experience and Monterey, and I'll never forget the look on her face when I told her. She is from a Mexican family as well, and this legend of the witches of Monterey is a very real thing for her as well. The scary part? I was telling her this story on a Friday, and according to what her family told her growing up, Friday is a forbidden day to talk about them, because that's one day of the week that they're most powerful. Apparently, they never forget their prey, and they use that day as a lure toward what was lost. Initially, I thought, that's BS. But I can't begin to express how many Fridays my wife had to stop me because I would randomly bring up the story. Maybe it was just self-conscious, I don't know. But it still kind of freaks me out to this day. My mom's side of the family lived in another town, about 7 hours away. We would visit from time to time. My aunt's houses were always haunted, and strange things were always happening there. I saw ghosts a lot. Well, this time, she lived at a ranch in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, my grandma on my mom's side passed away. We went to stay at my aunt's house to visit, and later to go to the funeral. While we were visiting the first night, my older brother and cousins stayed up in the kitchen, cooking and talking. My mom, dad, and I were all in the far bedroom, down the hall from the kitchen. I was watching TV, and my parents were falling asleep. My brother called me into the kitchen and asked me if I wanted corn on the cob. I said no. He asked me to ask my mom if she wanted one. I walked back into the room and asked my mom, and she said no as well. I went back into the hallway and told my brother that Mom didn't want any corn. But he just stared at me with huge eyes wide open. He just said, "Okay." I didn't think much about it at the time. I just thought that how he looked at me was really strange. The next day, my brother and I drove to town to get something to eat. That's when he told me, when I asked my mom if she wanted corn, that he saw a woman standing behind me. She followed me into the room. He thought it was my mom at first, but then the woman vanished. I told him Mom and Dad were laying in bed when that happened. That's why he was looking at me strangely. But he said that he didn't want to tell me that night because I would have been scared. We ended up getting a hotel the next night, and we didn't stay at my aunt's again. My brother was too freaked out. When my mother was a little girl, she spent her early years in a remote area of Mexico. No electricity, no running water, and definitely no air conditioning. Due to so many people all living in one small house, it wasn't uncommon for her and a few of her siblings to sleep on the porch. Yes, you heard that right. They slept on pallets outside. She recalls that it was actually much cooler some nights on the porch than it was in the house. The porch had a screen that my grandfather had installed, and he also built their house with his own hands. The closest neighbor was miles away, so from my understanding, the house was pretty much in the middle of nowhere. My mom and 3 of her other siblings were the lucky ones, who got to sleep outside every night. They never had any problems or fears, until the night that the baker boy began to come around. He was a small child with golden curls, dressed in white baking attire, wearing a mask that was real pigskin. He would walk in circles around the house, reciting a certain phrase that my mom never really understood, because it wasn't in Spanish or English. At first, they were scared, but over time, they grew to appreciate his presence. It was almost as if he was walking around the house to protect them from whatever fate had maybe happened to him. They never knew who he was, or if he was even real. They just knew that they all saw him. My grandpa never believed them, and assumed that they were making it up so they could come inside the house, but they swore that they weren't. It wasn't until, over time, an outline of his path began to show up around the house. Needless to say, they didn't stay in that house much longer, and moved before they eventually made it into the States. The strangest part is that before my grandpa died, he told my mom that he had finally seen him. The baker boy was real. Some friends and I recently visited an abandoned nursing home. We found all kinds of old, cool stuff, and it was really interesting walking around in there. We took a spirit box with us to see if we could get any interaction with ghosts. We were standing in a dark, empty room, put all our lights out, and turned on the spirit box. We made contact with multiple people. We asked them questions, and they responded. I had never talked to ghosts before, so this was really special for me. There were a lot of voices. We kept talking to them until we heard a very loud bang from upstairs. We were startled, and our first reaction was to turn everything off and stay silent for a while. After some time, it was still quiet, so we moved on exploring the rest of the building, until later, again we heard a very loud bang from upstairs. Again, we kept quiet and waited, but at this point it began to get really scary. We went upstairs, and we saw this big blood splatter against the wall. At that point, we knew that maybe it was time to go, so we were slowly heading back. We got right in front of a big closed door that we wanted to exit through when we heard a loud noise from the other side of it. We ran as fast as we could to the nearest exit. We actually had to crawl through a hole in the wall to exit the building. As we were outside, we looked up to the floor where we had heard the noise coming from, and we saw something that looked like a shadow standing in the opening of a hole in the wall. It was hard to see since it was dark outside. Still, to this day, I'm very curious about what was behind that door, but maybe it's better that we never found out. I'm pretty sure my roommate's house is haunted, but they don't believe in ghosts or souls very much, so they don't think much of the weird things that happened around here. You can clearly hear footsteps in the attic. I used to live in an apartment, so you can definitely tell what different sounds you hear. With that, they are very distinctly the footsteps of someone pacing in the attic. There's only one way in or out of it in my roommate's room, so I know it isn't some squatter or something like that. Things in the house move around on their own, too. It happens in front of my friend and I a lot, to the point where we're kind of used to it. Even though we're used to it, though, I would be more at peace with it if I knew more about the spirits here. Any attempt to contact them has failed, so I assume they just don't want to talk. I haven't had any negative encounters with them, though. The worst I've had is probably knocking over some stuff on the couch. Still, I just want to know what I'm living with. Is that too much to ask? I received a call from my brother with no caller ID or phone company record very soon after he died. It sounded like long-distance calls used to sound back when we all had landlines, as if he was very distant. At first I was perplexed, but once I said his name, things cleared up a bit, and soon after the call ended. I think his energy was just still strong enough that he had the ability to pop in to let me know he was okay. He's visited many times in other ways. The most concrete was a lucid dream in which he revealed that he was not relieved that his long battle with cancer was over. I have a good vocabulary, but he used terminology that I just would not have. It wouldn't have even been in my mind. So I know it wasn't my own mind trying to work through his death. He was more tethered in the time soon after his death. Now he just pays visits now and then, especially when I'm sick. I know it because sometimes I feel his hand on my forehead, something he always liked me to do for him when he was ill. My kids and I have had a lot of experiences, not just with him. But I'll always remember that phone call right after he died. So my family and I moved into a new house, which is a 2x4 house. It used to have an attic, but it's been sealed off. After a couple of months into living in this house, sometimes I would be watching TV and hear scratching from the roof. I just played it off, as birds are very common where I live. After about 3 weeks, the scratching got worse and more frequent. It's like something's trying to scratch its way out of the roof. The attic entrance thing is above the outside of my sister's room. One day, my sister tells my dad that the seal is open. My dad gets confused because it was supposed to be sealed off. My dad goes to close it and realizes that it's really hard to open and close, so whatever opened it had to be strong, and that's when I started to get skeptical. The same night, I went to get some snacks from the fridge. I opened it to find out that they were gone. I figured that my siblings must have eaten them. In the morning, my parents are going on and on about a missing cake. That cake was supposed to be for my niece's birthday. They asked if I had anything to do with it, and I said no, along with my siblings. I was getting really suspicious about the attic, so one day I built up the courage to go check it out. Note that I am probably the most paranoid person in the world, so I was scared for my life, but my curiosity got the best of me. I get the ladder, a torch, and a knife just in case. I open the thing up, and I shine my torch to see nothing. But as I search more, I see the cake, empty snack packets, dirty clothes, and a short, dark silhouette that freezes in its spot. Immediately I bolt and scream for my parents, and I tell them everything. They tell me to stay in my room. They go up and check, but he was gone. I am still shaken up about that moment, and I get nightmares from it to this day. We've since moved from that house and haven't had any more issues like that, and we live a normal, non-scary life, but I think that day will live with me forever. A couple of months ago, while I was sitting in a car wash, my music stopped, which always occurs when a call comes through. I looked at the media system to see who was ringing. It said, "Ma'am," M-A-M. I went to answer, and nobody was there, and the call ended. Ma'am isn't really common here, but it is what I called my mom, and how she signed off on her birthday cards. She was never, ever stored in my phone as ma'am, though. It was always under dad, and it still is, because they only had one landline between them. No missed or received calls on my phone were logged during that time. The thing is, my mom's been dead for a while now. 3 years, in fact. I shrugged it off as stress, except yesterday it happened again when I was driving. My husband was in the passenger seat, and he saw it with his own eyes. It occurred 3 times. The first time, the line was open for at least a minute, but nobody spoke. The second time, a bit shorter, and the third time, mere seconds. My husband is a complete skeptic, but he can't explain this, and neither can I. I did think maybe it was a spoofed number, but again, there's no record of the calls. It's like they never happened. I've lived in the same house for a decade now. The old lady who used to live here died, and her best friend still lives next door. I'm not sure how long she has left, but this house has always been spooky. It's always cold, it's really old, and I have had a lot of weird experiences for years. It's very common for me to hear footsteps, doors opening and closing, and my cat staring at random corners. My front door once opened and slammed closed by itself, and my mother saw an apparition of a Victorian lady in the front hallway in the middle of the night. I was also once home alone showering downstairs. and I heard somebody aggressively pacing back and forth in my room, opening and slamming my drawers closed. After a while, you get used to it, and you just accept the flow of things. For a while, the activity died down, and things seemed less scary. Plus, I moved away for university, so I got a huge break from the spooky stuff. But now I'm back, and the activity has spiked. A few nights ago, I was having a particularly hard mental health day. I was up at about 4 a.m., facing the wall, trying to sleep with my back to the door. My radio is always on at a low volume, and the music was playing. But I suddenly hear the voice of a woman behind me, almost groaning. It sounded like she was letting all the air out of her lungs, almost like wheezing. I freaked out, and when I looked, there was no one there. Yesterday, I was FaceTiming my boyfriend, and I heard footsteps in my house again, which I haven't heard in months. Distinct paces up the stairs, shuffling on the floorboards. I was genuinely scared, and even thought it was an actual intruder, but nobody was there. I'm scared that perhaps I'm manifesting something. I've never heard a woman before in this house, and the wheezing was so clear. I don't want to sound dramatic, but I'm scared of losing my sanity, and maybe I am, but my house has always been spooky, and this sudden spike has no real explanation. I'm going to try to smudge the house with some herbs that I gathered to feel a little bit safer. Hopefully, it works. My parents live in a community in the desert of southwestern United States. After graduating college, I spent some time living at their house, going through the misery of unemployment and applying for jobs. Being away from the city, their neighborhood can get really dark at night, especially when there are clouds or the moon isn't out. This neighborhood has had some issues with the paranormal. People have posted on the Facebook community page asking if anyone has had strange experiences, with the comments on the posts always blowing up, with people sharing encounters. Dogs barking and growling at entities not visible in the house, silverware and dishes going missing over time, only to later find it mysteriously in the attic, shadow figures, things like that. One late night, I was alone at their house, watching television. My parents were gone on vacation back east. My parents have this odd cat, who is the living definition of a scaredy cat. Even though it enjoys going outside, the cat won't go unless you're out there with it. If you go back inside, the cat will immediately be cowering in the windows, begging to be let in. As I was watching television, the cat comes darting past my feet to the sliding glass door that opens to the backyard. She was in that low, sneaking position that cats get in when they see something they want to hunt or pounce on. She was frozen, fixated on something in the back corner of the yard. Out of curiosity of what the cat was seeing, I opened the sliding glass door and let her out. She immediately runs up to the bushes in the corner of the yard and stops, still in the low, sneaking position. I walked outside, wondering what in the world was going on. This was one of those dark nights with no moon in the sky, making it difficult to see anything except the outline of the bushes. Suddenly, an orb of bright yellow light flies out of the bushes about the size of a softball. The orb goes up and over the cinder block wall into the neighbor's yard. Both the cat and I jump out of fright. I run back inside, being filled with the familiar dreaded feeling of being around something paranormal. Collecting my courage, I grab a flashlight and I go back out to see if anything's there, and to find the cat. I go back to the corner of the backyard, and I see nothing in the bushes where the orb had come out of. I search the whole yard, and I can't find the cat, who was also too little to jump the cinder block walls. The whole time I was outside again just felt wrong, like I shouldn't be there. I went back inside and waited a couple of hours until the cat finally showed up in the windowsill in a state of panic. I knew that I saw something with this experience because it was this little weird cat who brought it to my attention. A few days later, my parents are back from their vacation, and I tell them about my weird experience. This kind of freaked my mom out, who has read the community Facebook posts about the neighborhood having paranormal activity. Going to bed, I suddenly see a bunch of police cars show up outside the neighbor's house and our house. Police are getting out with their guns drawn. I alert my parents, and we lurk in the windows wondering what in the world is happening. I see the next-door neighbor girl outside, talking to the police. Nothing really happened except the police searched her house. The next day, my dad calls our neighbor, asking if everything was okay and if they could help. Apparently, their daughter was home alone while they were away. She was walking in the hallway when she saw a black, shadowy figure in the house at the end of the hall. She screamed and ran for her phone and called the police. The police searched the house and the surrounding area, but found nobody and didn't find any evidence of a break-in. It was the neighbor's house, their bushes actually, that the orb had flown out of a few nights prior. This encounter didn't happen to me, but to my mother. A couple of months ago, my great-aunt was in the hospital with the virus. At first it seemed like she was stable and would recover, but things took a turn for the worst about a week in. She had a heart attack, her lungs became damaged beyond repair, and she was brain dead, being kept alive by a machine. My cousins had to make a decision to keep her on it or let her pass. They went with the latter, and she passed away. Due to the fact that she had the virus, my immediate family and I were unable to visit her, as she was 3 hours away, and we didn't have the means to travel there, especially on such short notice. We were kept in the loop through phone calls from our family members, though. Although my mother managed to keep her composure during all of this, she took her death pretty hard, as she was really close with her growing up, and it was one of the few extended family members that she still talked to who was alive. Personally, for me, I hadn't spoken with her for quite a few years prior to this, but I do have great memories spending time with her during my childhood and teenage years. It's sad to think that so many of my family members growing up have now passed away. She had 2 dogs that my family and I took in, as my cousins were unable to. They were a mess when they first came into my house, as their last memories of my aunt were being rushed out of her apartment to the hospital, sparking anxiety in them, and being brought to a new home with people they haven't seen in well over a decade was a bit anxiety-provoking. I'm happy to report that they have acclimated to our home very well, and we've all been doing our absolute best to give them a happy and healthy life. A few weeks after the funeral, my mother was sleeping and was awoken by a phone call around midnight. She sleepily looked at her phone and jolted awake when she saw that it was my aunt calling. I'll be paraphrasing this, but here's essentially what my mother told me. When she answered the phone, she was greeted by my aunt, and my mother immediately asked, "How are you calling me?" To which my aunt replied, "Don't worry about it." My aunt went on to tell her that she wanted to let her know that she was okay and was now with several family members that had passed long before she did. Her husband, her mother, her sister, and so on. She wanted to let my mother know that she was very thankful for taking her dogs in and was glad to see that they were being well taken care of. She asked my mother to deliver a message to my cousin, her closest daughter. She wanted her to know that she didn't feel any pain when she passed, and that she was in a better place now. My mother understood and told her that she would tell her. My aunt thanked her, said she loved her, and the call ended. My mother is pretty open to the paranormal, so she wasn't too freaked out by this, and was very thankful and happy to have heard from her. The next morning, she delivered the message to my cousin. She teared up on the phone and thanked my mother for telling her. Now, I do recognize that this could very easily have just been a dream or some kind of hallucination on my mother's part. However, she swears that she was very awake and very aware during the phone call. She was walking around the house as she was on the phone with my aunt. And my sister was awake at the time and confirmed that she heard my mom walking around the house and having a conversation. My mom also has no history of sleepwalking or hallucinating for as long as I've been alive. And I'm assuming before that too. I personally believe that it was my aunt contacting her, and it makes me happy knowing she's out there in a better place with the people that she loves.